Thanks to anybody who's just joining the recording, but you've missed some stuff that I'm not going to go back over. So recipes can optionally also have these config and content folders. So the config folder is basically sort of your static YAML files of configuration that will be imported when you apply the recipe, similar to when you install a module or use sort of Drupal 4's configuration management system. And then the content folder are YAML files that will be basically content entities that will be created when you apply that recipe as well. So here's an example. This is actually a contrib recipe on Drupal.org. So you can apply this one and see what it does, but you can see here it's got the recipe.yaml at the bottom, the composer.json at the top. It's got a folder full of different config files. Those are all things that will be imported when you apply the recipe. And then you can see the content folder actually has a subdirectory for taxonomy term. And basically the content needs to be in subdirectories that are keyed by the entity ID of the kinds of entity that need to be created. And then you can see basically the file name within those are the UUID of the content that's going to be created. So the composer.json is going to be pretty similar to what you see for other kinds of projects, so modules or themes. But the key difference here is the type is Drupal recipe. You can also suggest other sort of projects or recipes. Currently, there isn't a lot that'll be useful for. It will be like if you're applying the recipe on the command line, it will show up at the end as sort of like suggestions there. There's talk that maybe one day Project Browser will sort of make those more visible, but for now it doesn't actually accomplish a whole lot. The recipe.yaml file has these sort of top elements that are pretty similar again to what you would see for like an info.yaml in a module. So things like name, description, type. But then now we start to get into some of the elements that are really specific to recipes. So you can specify one or more recipes optionally that you want to be applied at the start of this recipe being applied. You can also specify if there are particular modules or themes that you want to be installed in order for your recipe to apply. So in this case, we've got a couple of different paragraphs related modules that we want to get installed. And when it installs those, it will import sort of simple configurations, so like basic settings for file, but not any configuration entities that those modules or themes ship with. And so you have the option, if you want those imported, to sort of specify in this config section. So you can use this sort of wildcard to say import everything that it provides, or you can provide specific ones if there are sort of like individual configuration entities that you want to make sure get imported because your recipe depends on those. Then you can use configuration actions to do even more flexible things in terms of sort of importing or manipulating the configuration. I've heard people say that recipes are almost like the main course of Drupal Starshot, and to me, config actions are like the hot sauce that really make recipes exciting because there's so much flexibility that it really goes well beyond the capabilities that we had before importing configuration through like install profiles or modules. The key elements of a configuration action are, number one, the configuration entity ID of what you want to manipulate, either something that is going to be created or maybe something existing that you want to make a change to. Then there's the actual, the name of the config action that you want to use, and then you provide the actual argument. So it could be like, in this case, so you can see here we've got system theme. We want to use the action simple config update, and we're saying change the default value to this value emulsify. So when you break it down, it's not really complicated, but it's really powerful because there's this sort of rich library of config actions. Now, config actions is also an API, so you can define your own. There's sort of a growing list directly in core, and we'll get into those in a minute. But in a custom module or even in contrib modules, you can actually use this API to define your own config actions. So if there are particular ways that you need to manipulate site configuration that, hasn't been devised yet, you have the flexibility to go in and do that yourself. One thing I'll point out is that it uses sort of the modern PHP attribute notation as opposed to sort of the older doc block style for the documentation, which is pretty nice because it'll give you sort of like within your IDE some code coloring and some of those things. I'll draw attention to a couple of things. So number one, you have to provide sort of an ID for the config action. So you're basically telling Drupal like what's the name people are going to use to run this config action. And then optionally, you can specify one or more entity types. And if you omit this, that just means that this is a config action that can be run against any kind of configuration. But in this case, we've provided a value of user role, which means that this config action can only be used on user roles. So you have that flexibility. And ultimately, what that means as well is that the existing library of config actions can really be sort of broken down into two types. So the first type is the globally applicable entity actions. So these are ones that you can apply on any type of configuration. So things like a simple config update is one that we saw earlier. Create if not exists is one that I've used quite a bit. Set component, create, set third-party setting, and there's a variety of others. There is a QR code there if you want to go to the documentation page. I am also going to make all of these slides available. So any place you see a QR code, there's also that image is linked in the slides, so you can get there later on. So don't feel like you have to sort of scramble to keep track as we go through. Then there are a set of configuration entity actions that are really specific to individual types. So as an example here, we've got grant permissions, which is specific to roles. If you're working with workflows, you can use add node types or add taxonomy vocabularies. If you're working with fields, you can use add to all bundles, and so on. If you go to that link, in the bottom right, it goes to a page. There's actually, a quickly growing list of ones that are sort of specific to individual entities. I know not too long ago, a whole set specifically for manipulating views went in. And so it can be really a powerful way to provide a lot of capability, again, specific to the individual types. Now, there are a lot of things in the config actions that are also meant to make them really flexible so that you're not having to sort of repeat yourself in terms of the configuration you're providing. So you can use wildcards. In fact, the example here in the bottom left is saying if we want to affect every view display of every content type, you can actually use sort of double wildcards for that, which makes it, again, really, really powerful. It saves you sort of having repetitive changes as part of your recipe file as well. So some best practices if you want to start creating recipes. Probably the first and foremost is this idea of item potency, which is, before this year, a word that I had never heard before, but basically it's this idea that you should be able to apply a recipe again and again to your site without it causing an error. In practice, oftentimes this means that certain things I find particularly like form or view displays end up being best implemented as using config actions like create if not exists. There are some changes coming in sort of 10.4 to 11.1 that are going to make that less necessary, but we'll get to that as we go through. But definitely this is something you're going to want to test and sort of iterate and work through until you get that ideal of item potency. As a best practice, it's better to make recipes that are very granular. So instead of having kind of like one monorepo recipe that does lots and lots of things, have smaller ones and then maybe create one master recipe that pulls in and sort of applies all of those at once. And then definitely sort of publish and share those. It's, one of the things that's great about Drupal is, sharing with the community, getting feedback, helping each other when, new major versions come along that require changes. All of those good things. We did mention content. So recipes have the ability to actually create content in a very simple way. Essentially what they did is they took some of the elements of the default content contrib module, and particularly this section around being able to import content is actually now part of Drupal core as of, I think, 10.3. So essentially if you have that folder that we talked about in your recipe, that will get automatically imported. And if you want to add content to your recipe, probably the best way is to actually use the default content contrib module. It'll give you that path to create those. I think I've done it before with like a drush command. It'll actually output it, sort of nested into those subdirectories organized by the entities type ID. And then you can basically put all of those directly into the content folder within your recipe. And those should get applied whenever the recipe gets applied to your site. So here's an example of what a recipe.yaml file would look like. This is actually a recipe that we're going to apply later on indirectly as part of our demo, but you can see here at the top, we've got it installed so it names a variety of different projects, some in core and some contrib. It specifies some areas where it wants to make sure that the default entities get imported. And then there's a variety of config actions. So using create if not exist to sort of flexibly say, if this isn't already in the system, then make sure this gets created. But if it's already there, then don't worry about it. And certainly don't throw any errors if what we're suggesting doesn't match what's already in the database. And then from there, using set components to say, these are the different fields that we want to have as part of this display mode. So in terms of applying recipes to your site, eventually we're in the process, I guess it would be fair to say, of getting Project Browser to sort of be an interface for applying recipes. But for now, I've been doing it mostly on the command line. There is a script that's part of core, so you can do it sort of natively with more of a PHP call in the command line. There is a DDEV equivalent. Usually I just use the drush here at the bottom, and we'll see that in practice as we get to the demo. It's also good to know the order in which the recipe runner actually steps through all of the different inputs that are within a given recipe. So it's going to start by applying any other recipes that are specified. Then it's going to install the modules and themes, and again, import any basic configuration as it goes. And then it's going to import any of the specified configurations, so pulling in any additional configuration entities that were specified. Then it'll import any provided configurations, so that's the static files within the folder in the recipe. Then it'll apply any configuration actions, and then finally import any content within the content directory of your recipe. There was a lot of work that was done to take the core install profiles, so like minimal, standard, umami, and turn those into a set of recipes. It was, a massive amount of work, but it really taught the community a lot around what are the capabilities that recipes need to sort of provide a robust set of capabilities. If you want to use the command line to install using recipes, here's what that would look like. I'll also mention, just in passing here, I'm trying to move through this pretty quickly. There is a session later on towards the end of the day. Jim Birch and Adam, one of the communities known as Proxima, are going to be giving a talk about recipes. So trying to move through the high-level things as quickly as possible. And then if you want to deeper dive on some of those, definitely check out their talk later. So we talked earlier about best practices, keeping your recipes more granular. So here's an example. If you look at the standard recipe, it actually has smaller recipes for lots of the individual elements, and then the standard recipe just sort of pulls all of these individual ones to sort of create the same end product as if you had run using an installation profile. The umami install profile probably is going to be, I would say, less useful in terms of having elements that are going to be sort of, by design reusable across different sites. It's definitely more opinionated in terms of the outcome that it's trying to create. But I think can also be a good example of, creating something that feels more bespoke out of the box, using, again, the set of config actions and recipes. Generally, as a best practice, as much as you can, if there are recipes within core that are aligned with what you're trying to do, by all means leverage those. Certainly those are going to be well maintained over time. They're going to evolve as best practices change and those kinds of things. So where you can, if you can leverage those, that's going to make for sort of a lower total cost of ownership. And in terms of some of the things that the community is working on related to recipes, probably the biggest one right now, I would say, is this idea of unpacking recipes. So when you composer require and then apply a recipe, it's going to pull down all of those different dependencies. So it could be other recipes. It's going to be sort of modules and themes that both your recipe and those other recipes require. And then it's going to apply all those configuration changes. But now you have a lot of configuration that probably depends on a bunch of things that are only within your site thanks to them being composer required by the recipe itself. So if you composer remove the recipe, now you've kind of got a broken site because it's depending on things that are no longer in your code base. So the idea of unpacking a recipe is to say, figure out what that tree of dependencies is and actually put those into your site composer.json, and now you can actually remove the recipe and you have a perfectly functioning site. Again, the idea of a recipe is it should be, at the end of the day, the end state should be identical as if a human being went through and made all of those configuration changes by hand. There has been a lot of work around config validation. So early on in recipes, if there was some kind of a mismatch in terms of some required configuration element not being present, it might error out and your site would be in a really broken state. So now it sort of creates these config storage checkpoints. And then if something sort of fails validation, it can roll back to that. So there's some interesting capabilities that may be possible down the road using this idea of config storage checkpoints. Also, there's some work around making the config validation maybe a little less strict, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through as well. We did talk about how config actions are have the ability to use wildcards to make them more dynamic. But there is this idea of also being able to use things like placeholders, pass in sort of dynamic labels and so on to, again, make it much more flexible so you're not having to sort of write sort of repetitive, config action code as well. There is a roadmap. We've already talked about some of these elements like unpacking, recipe discovery, and so on. And there is already things like being able to prompt a user for a value. Again, right now, that's not something that's directly connected to the Drupal UI through something like Project Browser, but all things that the community is sort of looking to as part of a potential phase 2. And there's a Drupal issue linked here about that. There is actually a lot of really good maintainer and end user documentation already, but it's really in GitLab, so really not the sort of ideal place for users to be able to find that. And so, there is notionally this idea that all of that eventually should be migrated into other parts of the Drupal documentation system. There is also a recipes cookbook. So this is a wiki page. Great place to go if you want to start playing with recipes, see what's available. As you start to publish your own, by all means, go in and add links to those as well. I'm sure lots of people in the room have heard of Starshot. There's a link here to the page that's sort of the meta issue that lists all the different tracks. You'll see that most of these are recipes or recipe related. And I think the list just grew by 3 or 4 the other day. So, definitely an interesting place to understand how people are using recipes, see the approach that's being taken for some of these as well. One of the things that's coming in 11.1 is a new set of config actions for placing blocks. So previously you could place blocks through config, but you had to know the exact machine name of the theme that you wanted to place it in. You had to provide sort of like numerical values for like, the weight of where it would get placed, the exact region. Whereas using these config actions, you can say, place it in whatever the default theme is, place it in whatever the admin theme is, without having to know the machine name. You can say, look for this specific region, and if it's there, put it there, or you can call back to say, like, maybe use something that's almost always going to be there, like content, and then you can say, put it first in that region or put it last, as opposed to, again, having to give a numerical value that may not actually end up with the result that you're looking for. Something else that's coming in Drupal 11 is the ability to sort of turn off that strict check. So you can use this sort of strict false to say, create almost more of like a create if not exist type logic in terms of how it does those comparisons, but then still with the ability to say, for specific config entities, we want to actually do a more strict comparison to make sure that we actually have the starting state. So lots more flexibility, but again, something coming in sort of Drupal 10.4 and 11.1. All right, do a quick time check. I think we're doing okay. I wanted to get into some of the things that are specifically more event related. So there is now a Drupal core events recipe. There's drupal.org/project/events. It's going to give you an event content type using smart date fields. It's going to implement add to calendar links. It creates a view for upcoming and past events. There's still some tweaking around some UX improvements, a few other things, but generally this one is pretty stable. It's also the basis of what's already in sort of Drupal Starshot as the events recipe there. And if anybody saw the Dries node in Barcelona, it was sort of, you probably saw a lot of what's in there as part of that demo as well. There are also recipes for locations and events locations. We saw the YAML for this earlier. So it's going to set up an address and geofield handling for addresses. It's going to use sort of open source geocoding and mapping services. And then it's going to add a where reference to your events so that you can sort of connect addresses to your different event nodes as well. There's also an events calendar. So this was, I think the Barcelona demo that people might have seen was using a module called Full Calendar View. But if you go to the project page for that module, the maintainer has marked it as minimally maintained. It's actually directing people to contact him outside of Drupal.org about a paid version to like use the latest version of the Full Calendar library and get like commonly requested features, even features people have like community posted patches for. So based on some of those things, we've basically revived the Full Calendar module that was really popular in Drupal 7, brought it up to date, works with Drupal 11, works with the latest version of the Full Calendar module, has drag and drop capabilities. Next steps for a Full Calendar module are some performance improvements, as well as implementing some options for tooltips. So watch for that in the coming weeks as well. There's also an add-on recipe called Events Registration that uses the Entity Registration module, which is super cool because now you can do registrations in Drupal that are fieldable. So if you have some events where you need to capture things like t-shirt sizes, or some events where you need to capture things like, dietary restrictions, you have lots of flexibility to be able to do different kinds of registrations that have different fields that you need to capture. I think there's probably going to be some ongoing work around just making the overall user flow of registering as simple as possible, and time allowing, maybe we'll see an example of that. One of the most recent is a recipe called Events Recurring. So basically, out of the box, the Smart Date module has the ability to use recurring events. It does require installing a submodule and then making basically 3 configuration changes as a best practice. But again, because the whole idea of recipes is to make it much simpler for site builders, basically to make it so they don't have to have that technical knowledge to set up a best-of-breed content architecture. The idea is you apply this one recipe and you have all of those steps performed for you. But in its current state, it does sort of break item potency. So, beware that, if you apply this recipe, then you may have challenges applying some of the other ones. So I would say today you would want to do this one last. But some of the changes that we talked about sort of strict checking that are coming in 11.1, hopefully will resolve that issue with item potency. So this is the exciting part where we get into a live demo. So what I have here is a Drupal 11 site. It's fairly stock. There's a couple of things. So like the Gin admin theme, a couple of very small admin things. But if we go up here, you can see that it's only got the article and basic page content types. So what we're going to do is go into our command line and actually apply the events recipe. So it's going to go ahead and make these changes. Oh, let's say today. you want to make sure after applying a recipe to clear the cache. There is an issue open about that. So if anybody's looking for a place to contribute, by all means, work around at that. And now if you go in here, you can see we've got the ability to add an event as well. We've got an event section in our navigation. When we go in here, obviously there's no content yet. We notice we have tabs for upcoming and archived events. We can click the prominent link to go ahead and create our first event. Publish our test event, throw that sometime next week. Notice that we've got sort of a Google Calendar style way to specify the duration. Nice and clean interface, and now save that. We go back here, we can see that's already listed, and if we go in, you can see we've got our add calendar links, and we're going to pull through the title and the time that we set there as well. This will also, in Olivero's front-end theme, automatically sort of pull through link colors. So these are SVGs, but automatically colored by whatever link color your theme is using. So if we go back to our command line here, let's maybe add a calendar. One thing I'll point out is the calendar and all of these other recipes that we're going to go through require the events recipe as a starting point. And so it's actually rerunning that events recipe for each of these ones that we do. So by the time we're done, we'll have run that events recipe multiple times. And that's why that item potency concept is so important. So let's go ahead and pick our cache again. And now if we go back here, we go back to our events view, notice that we have a new tab here now, the calendar, and now we've got our interactive calendar here. So it's giving us sort of toast style notifications as it makes those updates, and also go into a particular day and change the time or even the duration. And then we can also do things like say, well, let's interactively make that an all-day event. And then if we go back to, let's say, our month view, we could also say, let's make that all day across 3 days. Move that around. And then if we just go back, we can see that those changes have been saved to the database as well. So that's a quick view. I guess one other thing that I'll mention with the calendar, you can already do things like say, maybe we want to display events that are in different content types and different colors, or display them in different colors based on things like how they've been tagged. So maybe you've got an event type taxonomy. Those are all different kinds of things that you can do with Playground. Let's go ahead and do our events locations. And measure, make sure we clear the cache. We go back in here, go to the page. See, we've got a locations section. Includes a locations map, which of course, because we have no content, is showing us a nice picture of the ocean. But we could say, let's get Boston, leave that in the United States. Through State Street, save it. And now our locations map is automatically centered on what's currently the only event that we have on the site, but as we grow, it will sort of change to display all those different locations. Now, if we go back to our test event and edit, notice that we have now this where field. I would say for me personally, as a best practice, probably using something like inline entity field would be a better user experience. This is kind of simpler out of the box. So there we go. So you can see now we've got that displayed inline. We could obviously have, different options for displaying a map here as well. But again, trying to keep things relatively simple as a default and let site builders add complexity as they deem appropriate. Let's also go ahead and see that events registration. one thing I can also point out here again for that idea of item potency, just apply the same recipe twice and that works just fine. Let's go ahead and clear our cache for good measure. And now if we go back and add a new event, point out here that at the bottom, by default, it's enabled this default registration type of signup. And that's pretty simple. So it's not going to apply that retroactively to existing content. So if we go back to here, you have the ability to add it, but it's not sort of automatically going to change any existing event nodes to include signup. But by default for new ones moving forward, it'll do that. But as sort of a content creator, you have the ability to sort of select whether you want it enabled, which kind, if you've got different ones that are sort of capturing different fields, potentially have different workflows, all those things. And we go ahead and save that just so you can see what that looks like. Probably at some point that should default to being myself, but again, that's part of that ongoing process of figuring out what's the sort of most intuitive workflow that we can provide for this. And then the last one that we're going to do is go ahead and do something that we know is going to break our item potency. It's recurring. Just to prove my point, there we go. That's the big ugly error that you get when it says you've done something a little bit bad. But if we go ahead here now and add a new event, let's just call this our event. And notice now we have this new repeats field, so we can say, let's repeat that weekly, ending after 5 times. We will start that a little bit in the past. To save that. So you can see that it's actually using now by default a new formatter that's designed specifically to provide a better output for recurring events. So, if this was repeating indefinitely, you wouldn't want to have like 100 different dates and times displayed. So it has a configurable number of recent and upcoming events displayed. But if we go into our events calendar, you can see that it has all of those displayed automatically in the calendar. We can do things like drag and drop a particular instance. Maybe we want to change the time as well. And then we could go back into that event display. You can see again that those changes apply to just that one instance as an override. So that's sort of a super quick overview of, or a demo, I guess, of the different capabilities available as part of the events-related recipes that are available today. And maybe we'll just sort of quickly wrap things up and open things up for questions here. So, of course. Not the best.
A real live demo you'd have shown that password.
What's that?
Got fed rent.
Yep. All right. Last thing I wanted to touch on very quickly is something called the event platform. So, and I'll explain the relevance when we get there in a sec. So the whole idea of the event platform is it's really meant to be a replacement for what used to be called the camp organizers distribution. It provided a really rich set of capabilities for people wanting to set up a website for some kind of a Drupal camp. But the event organizers working group sort of started this initiative to modernize it because it had never sort of made the jump from Drupal 7. So the event platform really is that. It was sort of built as a set of modules that really, for the most part, delivered a set of configurations. So like very closely aligned with the idea of recipes before recipes were really a thing. So it provides things like a single centralized form to manage all of your event information, provides content types for sessions, featured speakers, sponsors, job listings, like a whole bunch of different things. It will create automatic notifications when the session is submitted, accepted, or rejected. It has tools to do things like bulk generate time slots, drag and drop, and schedule your sessions into like time slots and rooms. But most critically, and why we're talking about today, is it's soon to be a set of recipes, which I think will both expand, like was already a driver of the block placement config actions that we talked about earlier, was sort of a lot of the development was specifically to support this initiative. So I see this as helping to drive forward like recipes in the flexibility that they provide, but in addition to providing a set of capabilities that hopefully will be applicable to even more use cases, as the work that goes into turning these into recipes makes them potentially more broadly available. And probably everybody here, for some reason this isn't showing, if I just escape out, probably everybody here is familiar or has used a site based on the event platform, because the New England Drupal Camp website is using that as well. So the last thing here is to talk about, hopefully some of you are so inspired by what we've talked about that you're ready to join the initiative and start helping out. So anybody who wants to help, certainly we talked about the documentation before. So, that work of porting the existing documentation into one of those documentation systems on Drupal.org, that would definitely be a big help. If you're ready to start, working on, developing or improving config actions or other kinds of, recipe-related functionality, helping test the functionality, providing feedback, or writing test coverage, those are all amazing things. If you want to start building your own recipes and maybe identifying where there are gaps in some of the capabilities, that would be excellent as well. There is a recipes channel in Drupal Slack, so that's a great place to hang out if you want to understand, like, what are some good ways to get started? Or, I got stuck at this place. Who can help me, get over that and move on to the next thing? That's a great place to go. And there are asynchronous meetings in there every other Tuesday at 1600 UTC. So that's depending on daylight savings time, roughly noon, I guess. There are usually contrib days at DrupalCon. So DrupalCon Singapore coming up. I don't know how many people of us are going to be fortunate enough to go, but certainly envious of you if that is you. I did mention earlier there is a recipe section or session coming up this afternoon. So that'll be back here in this room at 3 p.m. But hopefully at least you have enough to get started. So one more tea. Open it up for questions. There are stickers here. That is the QR code for the slides. So if you're interested in any of the links, then that's a good one to grab. So are there any questions? Yes.
Question. I was wondering about the events. If paid event registration is part of this or on the roadmap.
Great question. I actually didn't mean to mention that on the registration slide. So there is a registration commerce module available. So it's going to be a little more involved than just like using Eventbrite in terms of the setup, but you have the benefit of having a lot more control and probably paying fewer fees. So there is definitely a path there for that. Yes.
Is it allowing like separate payment methods, or is there like a preferred one that, like, could you use Square or PayPal or anything that you choose?
Yeah. So within the commerce ecosystem, there's lots of different payment providers that are supported. Sure.
What's the Drupal cliff size for making recipes, for, say, modifying a recipe? Like, how many hours after pulling up before you're actually getting stuff done?
I guess, well, hopefully that's unidirectional, so I'm not going to repeat the question. In terms of creating a recipe, I guess to some degree, the answer is it's like, how long is a piece of string? It's sort of depending on how ambitious your recipe is. I've had some recipes that took a lot of time. So like, I think the locations one for me was one that took a long time because the configuration behind it was something that I was probably a little less familiar with. There were lots of different elements that sort of had to come together.
What's the small size?
Well, so the events recurring one is one that I think was like a couple of hours. So, and if you look at it, there aren't a lot of files to it, so you can see that. But on the other hand, it's like kind of broken, right? Like the item potency thing is a thing that is waiting for a core change to come through in a release to be able to sort of fix that. So it's like, yeah, there's no easy answer, and it'll depend on, factors like, your familiarity with the system. So like as you make more of them, they'll get easier to make. There are some things that are potentially helpful. So like the features module in modern Drupal does a nice job of taking a set of configuration. So you can say, these are the things that I want to pull together, and it'll pull together all of the configuration, including dependencies. It puts them currently into a module structure, but you could use it as a UI to say, this is the configuration I want it to track, and it'll pull all that together for you. And then you just copy and paste it into a recipe structure. And that could be a big time saver. You'd still have to do the work of probably like moving some things into config action and some of that other stuff. But that's potentially useful. There is a VS Code extension that'll help you to do like autocomplete on config actions and some other things. So like the tooling is starting to come along to help with that. But yeah, the cliff size I would say is not small. So
You said there wasn't an answer, but you can write a broken one really fast. A question about the suggests. That's really a composer thing, not a recipe spelling. Is it generally, you said, maybe used to suggest other recipes, but really you could suggest any composer package with that?
absolutely, yeah.
Is there any utility in it?
I mean, so to me, I would say the utility is mainly today for me to keep track of what I think are good next steps for somebody. And anybody who's willing to poke around in the code and like, oh, I just installed the events recipe. What are the things that the author of that recipe thinks are potential candidates for other things to do? You can sort of like glean that yourself. It's not a small thing, certainly not as useful as it could be if there are ways of like bubbling that up through the UI or different things. But not useless today. So that's probably as much as I can say about that.
And I guess what would the utility be of suggesting a non-recipe component? Is there a use case for that?
Well, so as a simple example, if you go to the Smart Date project page, there are other modules that it says could be used with that. So there's like remove extra fields, and I forget there's a couple of other ones. So you could put those on there to say like, if you've installed this recipe, here are other things that might provide capabilities that would be useful to you.
So like commerce registration might not have a recipe that plugs into it. You're not going to suggest that non.
Yeah, great example. Yeah. Yes.
What's the process look like when you're removing the recipes? So say like you need to remove the location one, but it's location data say so.
All right. So this gentleman, right away is across the room. So I'm going to repeat just for the sake of recording because I did such a bad job at the start. Question was, if you need to remove a recipe, what does the path look like? And the answer is today there really is no sort of formal path. I will say certainly the ones that we've seen today are very event based. And so if all of a sudden you were like, I don't want to use any of this anymore, I want to just sort of like rip all of that out and start from scratch using some other, date field as an example. Removing the events recipe, the event content type would basically pull out, I think, everything except the locations content type that we saw installed today in our demo. So if you just deleted those two content types, you would basically remove everything that was added to your site from those recipes. So it'll depend on the recipe, but by design, there isn't really meant to be a method right now of saying, basically go backwards. Now, that being said, there is that storage checkpoint that we talked about earlier on. So there might be the possibility of somebody creating a module one day that says, before applying a recipe, create a checkpoint there that I can then maybe later go revert back to. So that might be a thing. Oh, Jim has his hand up. You might know something about this.
It is on the roadmap. So there are checkpoints that are made. And on our phase 2 roadmap, we would like to be able to revert recipes. But no work has happened.
It's a great place to start if you want to contribute.
Yes. So what you should do is create your own checkpoint, take a config snapshot, do a backup, or you do it, then you can just go back, drush CIF.
Yeah, or if you're using DDEV, like for the demo today, I always do like a DDEV snapshot. Give it a name that's like easy and intuitive to revert back to, and that's a nice way to do it as well. Any other questions? We're over time, but I don't see anybody like getting here. So good. So there are stickers at the front. I think that's on the slide, but thanks for coming.